We're stronger together.
Well, hey, welcome everybody to the Weathering Together podcast, part 2, I guess, maybe a little rebranding.
Yes.
Many of you may have listened in to an episode I did probably last year where I interviewed Marrin who is my work colleague, my friend, and now a partner in this Weathering Together venture. So,
yes. Hi, everyone. We're so glad to be here and to be here in the same and also a new and exciting way. And we wanted to start off by talking a little bit about left and right brain and going into a bit of neuroscience, a bit of storytelling, a bit of connection of why left right brain when we want to talk about human relationships. What is that big jump, and why is that the first thing that we want to talk about?
And I think it's important. I think Marrin and I were talking about that before we even started recording here. Our work together, we both work for the state of Virginia. Our work is around adverse childhood experiences. And I tell this story often. I told a group the other day that it was 7 years ago, I think, that I was in a presentation at a workshop on adverse childhood experiences. And because of some work I had done in my previous work life with at-risk kids, because of my own personal story, because of just a lot of things in life, not the least of which was my work life, which was focused a lot on promoting mental health and preventing substance abuses and misuses. That presentation had a life-changing impact on me. 7 years ago, I had no idea why. I just felt it. And at that time, it just explained in a really scientific way what I had always felt intuitively, that the things that happen in the earliest days of our lives and the environments that we grow up in the earliest days of our lives, they mean something about our long-term well-being. But this ACEs study that's at the foundation of a lot of the work that we do, in a scientific way, said this is true. What happens early in life has real impacts on who we are and what we experience later in life. But where Marrin and I, and a lot of it has been in conversations like this, where we are today is a little more specific than that. And I think we would both say it this way, that what happens to us early in life has real implications on certainly the relationships that we have early in life. But those relationships have a real impact on our relationship patterns all through life. And if you believe what we believe, and we'll be talking about for probably a long time to come, that our greatest source of health, our greatest source of protection from a lot of things that might ail us in the world, our greatest protection from almost everything is each other, is our connection to one another, is our capacity to weather together. And because of the work we've done, we realize that some people get an opportunity to weather together well based on early childhood experiences, early childhood relational patterns. And other folks are a bit handicapped in that. If you don't figure out how to weather together as a young person, that's a really difficult thing to figure out going forward in life. So a lot of this podcast will be talking about the science of relationships, the emotions with relationships, sort of the spiritual undertone of relationships. And that really does start with the human brain.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's what in our work and also personally in our interest in psychology, relationships, mental health, we have always come back to, both in conversations and as a foundation for the work we do from the state of, why do you think the way you think? Why do I think the way I think? Why do I think the way I feel? Or why do you feel the way you feel? And so I think that brain science and neuroscience quickly became this underlying foundation to our work in relationships and in human connection, because that is how we connect. We connect through each other, but we see, feel, process, think each other through our brains. And so being able to understand in some level the way that our brains work, the way that they keep us together, the way they can keep us apart, I think is pivotal in this conversation. And it's why we find this so exciting and fascinating, but also really important and foundational to this conversation about how we see one another and how we have healthy relationships.
Yeah, and I will say that I get up now and I get the opportunity to talk a lot about the human brain. If you'd have told me 7 years ago that I would be out talking to folks about the human brain, I would have said you're out of your mind. Number one, I had never really thought much about my own brain, let alone anyone else's. I certainly knew nothing about the brain. I was not a science guy. I joke a lot that Amazon drops off a new book every day about neuroscience, and it is very true. Marrin knows that as well as anyone, because I'm frequently reaching out to her with a new quote or a new book recommendation. But I think that's the first thing that we all need to do. Like, we all need just to stop right now when you're listening and just back up and pretend you are looking at the human brain. And we're just going to talk real quick. In coming episodes, I know we will talk a lot more. We'll probably get into individual pieces and parts of the brain. It's a complex system. And so I'm not going to pretend that we can give you, a thorough understanding of the whole brain in this 1 hour conversation we'll have today. But I think we can all talk about the starting point of the brain's development in a way that will help us connect with the importance of understanding the brain when it comes to understanding human connection and human relationships. And in our presentations, I always show a picture of baby Elliot, right? Everybody knows it as my baby Elliot picture. And it's this picture of Elliot when he was less than 12 hours old, and he's in an incubator, and I have my hand reaching into that incubator, and Elliot's eyes are just fixated on me. And if you think about that in terms of the brain, which comes into the world with very few sort of brain connections, no child comes into the world with any preconceived notions. They don't come in with any sort of pre-written thoughts. We all just come into the world with feeling, right? And senses. And so baby Elliot's there as I'm reaching a hand in. He doesn't have a brain that says, here comes dad's hand. All he sees and feels is, how does this activity, this hand coming into my life, how does that make me feel right now? And the one common thing our brain is searching for in all of us when we come into the world, and every day, like this never changes. Our brain is constantly scanning for threats to our safety, because the brain's first sole purpose is to make sure that we're all kept alive. And safety obviously is key to that. So we always talk about the brain in 3 levels, and then right and left. I'm just going to really, really quick talk about those 3 levels. We come in, the part of our brain that's most developed is this brain stem piece of the brain. It's our lower section of the brain, and it's automated. Like, it's the part of the brain that's saying heartbeat, lungs, breathe, right? Immune system, protect, hunger. The baby doesn't know I'm hungry, so it has to feel it so that it will cry. That's all happening in this lower section of the brain. It's the brain that's most developed, and that's the brain stem. And then the next layer that starts to develop is what we call the limbic system. And that, again, develops in response to the baby's crying. Does someone show up? Does someone comfort me? And this part of the brain starts to develop in response to relationship. And then we get to this higher part of the brain, which we call the prefrontal cortex and all the lobes. And this is where a lot of our higher level thinking comes from. And this section develops in response to this connection we have with someone else. The baby cries, the mother shows up, or the dad shows up. There's this connection there. And now this adult can say, let me start to teach you. Let me say words to you that you can start to then know and recognize and start to put definitions to. And Marrin and I were talking here a little bit ago. It's, baby Elliot, he saw me smile, right? And in that instant, he felt a smile, but he had no idea it was the word smile, right? A word just becomes this representation of some experience we've had in life, and all of us experience things differently. A smile does not mean the same thing to everyone, but that smile is something baby Elliot feels, and then over time, as the brain develops, that's when a higher level thinking part of the brain starts to put a word to that. And this is really critical to understand when we start talking about relationships and the brain science with that, and understanding in the earliest seconds of our life. Our lives are dependent on, and our brain growth develops in response to our connections with one another. Literally in the earliest seconds of our life, we are wired to weather together. And then the last piece of that is, I gave you the sort of bottom to top development of the brain. We also have this right and left part of the brain. And to be honest, Marrin and I spend a lot of time lately talking about right brain, left brain. And my guess is when you hear that, you think of it in terms of how we represent that culturally a lot of times.
There's a judgment to personality usually when someone hears right or left brain. Like, oh, I'm a left brain thinker, I'm a right brain thinker, I'm type A or I'm creative. But that's not actually the case neurologically within us.
Right. Mm-hmm. The idea is not either or, but how do we get them to talk to one another? Right. And Marrin and I are both storytellers. We both love to write. And a lot of people would hear that and say, oh, you all must be right-brained, like you're creatives. No, I think a lot of that comes from our capacity to have our right brain talk to our left brain. Yeah. There's actually a brain part. It's called the corpus callosum, and its sole purpose in our brain, it goes right down the middle, is to sort of be this communication channel for the right brain and the left brain to talk to one another. So the right brain stores a lot of our emotions and a lot of our feelings. The right brain, I look at Marrin right now, and any feeling I have about being present with Marrin is a right brain activity. Left brain activity would be, oh, your name is Marrin, and you come from Montpelier, and you work at, it's all these sort of definitions about Marrin. And so it's important for me to have a whole story about Marrin, to know what I feel in Marrin's presence, and then how I would speak to that, how I would write to that. And one of the challenges then, as we start talking about relationships and we start talking about early childhood, is we can get into situations in early childhood where we have emotions, but we don't have opportunities to talk about those in a way that uses that left brain, right, to put words to these emotions and feelings, which then gives us the capacity to tell our story in life. We have some challenging emotions. We all have challenging experiences. That is life. What becomes more damaging than those experiences themselves is not having the opportunity to tell the authentic story about those things. And where that starts to go forward in life and complicating things, I think we both agree, and I think all of you would agree, that, the most meaningful relationships we have are when we can be our most authentic selves with one another. And what can happen, and again, this will be an episodes long conversation that we'll revisit over and over, but one of the complications that happens in our brain when we have challenging childhood experiences is parts of our brain don't get really good at talking to one another. And this right brain, left brain conversation is just one of them, not being able to put words to my emotions. If I can't put words to my emotions, if I can't be authentic with my own story, and then I want to relate to Marrin with that story, but it's not an authentic story, suddenly we're having an inauthentic connection.
Right. And I mean, to go back to what you were saying about just true, like quick early brain development, I think a lot of the times within this conversation, from what the work we do at the state of, whether it's labeled ACEs, whether it's labeled childhood trauma, whether it's labeled early adversity, or just what we go through when we're younger, I think in some conversations I've had with friends, with family, there's this notion that, well, I don't remember that. Like that wasn't, we just had a conversation about that actually, of labeling, that didn't actually affect me. So blah, 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 or a dismissal, and it could be an authentic dismissal of, well, I don't feel that. I don't have bad memories associated. And that word memory is really what you're talking about, is only one little piece of your brain. It's only part of that third layer of cortex that you're talking about. And so when we look from an early childhood perspective, what is so fascinating is that even the things that we don't, in our adult lives and wherever retrospect looking back, things that we don't label as important, they could have had a really pivotal effect on the way that those three layers formed in us. And so that's the importance of understanding the effects that and when I say what we go through, I even just mean things like birth order, birthplace, if you were born premature, if you were if you had a traumatic birth, who was around you in your first year of life, 2 years, all of those things that we wouldn't left brain now logically in an adult fashion or in a even creative or right brain way, something we wouldn't identify as effective or cause and effect or still with us, they may have had a huge toll on the way that our brains developed, on the way that we were able to link our left brain, right brain story, on the stories that we started to tell ourselves as a result as we developed. And so I think that's just a really important piece of the conversation, is that when we say what we experience as babies and early childhood has an effect on the way our brains develop, it could be things that it's not necessarily trauma. It's just where we were, what happened, if we felt safe or unsafe. And that's key, I think, to understanding the importance of why we talk about brain development. Why are we talking about processing order? Why are we talking about left brain, right brain?
Yeah, and understanding. I heard this not too long ago, and it made so much difference to me in reflecting on present day relationships, present day relationship challenges. And that was this. What Marrin is talking a lot about is some of these stories, some of these things that shape our early childhood relationship experiences. It's not like then, and this is the brain perspective. And so we have to understand what the brain is constantly doing is trying to create patterns. Our brain wants to automate as many processes as possible because it wants to save all of its energy. Because the brain, again, is always sort of scanning for things that are threats or scanning for things that may be unique or may be unusual. It wants to spot those to come up with some sort of plan of action. So what it does to create as much energy as possible for that scanning is automate as many processes as possible. Like walking, right? None of us say left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. We're not thinking our way through walking. I'm going to get up from here and I'm just going to walk. I'm not going to think about it. Driving becomes one of those things. And that's because we have patterns in our brain that have been set aside and drawn up specifically for those activities. They tell the brain, I've got this. You don't have to think about that. You focus on keeping me safe. I got walking. I got driving. I've got all these eating. I got all sorts of things. The same thing happens with relationships. We figure out in a relationship how we need to respond in that relationship to keep it feeling comfortable, to keep it feeling safe. And that looks really, really different from relationship to relationship. A therapist who, Marrin's going to laugh now because he's kind of become my hero, Dr. Kurt Thompson. He's written several books on what we're talking about here. He's big in putting sort of this conversation on a faith context. He's a therapist. But he gave this example he about a client that he was meeting with. And the client had a hard time communicating with his spouse. And anytime anything would get remotely sort of challenging in that experience, he would go jump in his car and drive away. He needed to go get his space. And that was just his typical response anytime anything got challenging. So Dr. Thompson, as he was working through this with him, started asking about childhood. And turns out that in childhood, he had a challenging relationship with his dad. And anytime anything would get challenging and the emotions would come up that he didn't want to deal with, because dealing with emotions in that relationship wasn't what happened, he would jump on his bicycle and he would ride off in the neighborhood to escape having to deal with that part of the relationship. And so what he has done then, it's not that he took this childhood experience and that becomes a relationship pattern that stays here. What happens is we repurpose that pattern for all the other relationships in our life going forward until we have some sort of meaningful experience with somebody else that helps us reshape them. Until then, we're just going to take, if we decide that our brain figures out that a relationship is something that I have to protect myself from, if the emotions in a relationship are something that are really uncomfortable for me, that we aren't a relationship that dives into emotions, we're one that we want to keep those things as far apart from one another as possible. If that's the relationship pattern we develop to protect ourselves from it, that's what we will take into the classroom with teachers. That's what we will take into friendships. That's what we will take into marriages. And that's why this conversation we have about brain science and early childhood development is so important, because the relationship patterns of our youth are the patterns that we repurpose for relationships down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just think that that's so key. And I think it's something that when we're talking about healthy relationships, when we talk about big concepts like empathy or even therapy, marriage, just friendship, any of these things that we can all agree that we want to be better at. No one says, oh, I don't want to be good at relationships. I don't want to work on that. I'm all good. Like, everyone agrees that it's the core of our life. It's love and connection is the foundation of how we're human. But what I don't think we're good at culturally, certainly in America and Western civilization, is reflecting on our why, giving ourselves permission, space, and some set aside time to understand, why am I responding this way? Why is this person responding this way? Both empathy towards one another, but also to ourselves. And I think that having those conversations about, like Dr. Kurt Thompson's example, having these conversations about why I have this response because of this pattern that developed when I was younger. This is how I've always responded. I've never questioned it until now. Both learning your own responses, learning your own patterns, your own left and right brain connection patterns, your own processing, that helps you both understand yourself and helps the lens of learning about others too. You can't really have true empathy with another person, I would argue, until you've learned yourself a little bit, because approaching with curiosity of why do you feel the way you feel, in order to really grasp and understand why someone acts the way they do, you need some sort of understanding and permission to understand why you feel the way you do. And I think that's the importance of why, when we started this work together, I come from a academic background of psychology and neuroscience, and Keith started approaching it from a personal background to neuroscience. And so we kept kind of talking about the brain in like little ways. And then we sort of scratched at that and we're like, why are we both talking about the brain so much? This is so separate. But it's because I think we began to understand that when we're talking about connection, relationships, and relational health, talking about the brain is the key to starting empathy with yourself and with other people.
Yeah, and again, understanding how the brain works. Once you understand it, you have some domain over the brain. And once you have some control over your brain, you can impact your relationships in a way that you maybe couldn't when you didn't understand the brain. And I say this all the time, doing presentations, and it's not accusatory as much as that. It's just what I've experienced in life. It's certainly personal. And that is that we're all really bad at relationships. And I mean, really bad at deep connected relationships. And that's because the relationships that protect us, the relationships that bring healing, are the relationships where we can enter into all the way back to birth, right? We came into this world entering into each other based on emotions, based on being able to feel one another, to being open. Like a baby doesn't hide any emotion. Sometimes we wish they would, like just quit crying, just quit. But that's being able to express ourselves is as primitive in our own personal lives as it is in the brain. The most primitive function we had when it came for needing and seeking the help of another is emotions. Baby Elliot didn't say, Dad, I need some help.
Right.
That developed after the emotions. That developed as he was able to put words to the emotions. And if you can't do that, like if you don't learn that, if that doesn't become your relationship pattern, you're not going to go into any other relationship in life, not a friendship, not a marriage, not an employee-employer relationship, where you can walk into an office and say, you know what, I'm feeling kind of frustrated about this assignment. You can't go into home after a hard day with a spouse and say, man, I really am struggling with this today. I just feel, if you've never done that, you're not suddenly going to start doing it. And so what you will do instead is try to build connections based on more checkboxy things. We were talking earlier about, social media or any other sort of outlets where we can kind of portray relationships in a more visible and the pressure we feel to represent that as this all-American family, this all-American friendship, marriage, what have you. But none of that is based on feelings. None of that is based on in-depth connection. It's just based on very superficial. And I think that's because we build a lot of our relationships on things that are more superficial. And I think we do that to protect ourselves. That becomes a diversion from the emotions and the feelings that come with.
Right. I have a question about something you said. I want to know what your thoughts are on it. I mean, I think sometimes I feel like there's a resistance to even approach or unpack our brain patterns, because there is this one, I think it's a protectiveness of our childhood sometimes of, whether it is out of positive memory, whether it's preservation, repression, any of the above, sometimes there is this, no, I mean, I don't want to, I don't see the point in looking back. I just want to focus on right now. I don't want to go into what happened when I was younger. I just want to focus on the now. And I think that is sometimes a protectiveness for our patterns, because we don't want our patterns to be seen. We don't want to know where they came from. There's a fear to that. And I'm just wondering, what do you think that comes from? Because I do think that is why, I don't know, there's a quote, it's kind of like, if they wanted to, they would, or if you wanted to, you would. And so I think that, it's not this aha moment, which we don't come to that when we talk about relational health and all these things. Hardly ever do we say something that someone doesn't know already, but it's just this challenging the resistance in you, I think. So I'm wondering, what do you think is the something that is not societally accepted to identify our patterns and to share our patterns with someone else? Do you think that's present? Do you think that that's like a problem today?
Well, no, it definitely is a problem, but I would say from individual, the reason behind that is probably different. And I'll just talk from my own standpoint. And you and I've talked, most anybody listening to this will know, in the last several years, I went through a broken marriage. And when you go through that, you start looking at your life in a lot of different ways. And certainly I've had to look at that through the lens of this work we are doing, through relationships. And I've had to accept and come to this place of knowing that in my role in relationships has largely been avoiding any sort of feeling, avoiding any sort of intimacy. Because again, I think what childhood sets up for us in terms of the definition of relationship, and it's obviously more complicated than this. There's a lot of middle ground.
Right.
But to me, you can point to one or two ways in terms of the label you would put on your relationship patterns and your definition of relationships early in life that you carry forward. And that is this: relationships become something that I want to connect with because they serve a protective factor in my life, or relationships become something I need to protect myself from because that serves me best in protecting my life. Yeah. I would say that I have lived a life protecting myself from relationships. My history has been, anytime a relationship got someplace where it was close, and by close, I mean, okay, now you have to start sharing who you really are, what you really feel, what emotions you're currently going through. When it got to that point, that's where I would find ways to back off. When you get there and you start having the conversation we're having, then you have to look at a much broader story in your life. Right. These relationship patterns you're having today, they aren't new ones. No. They've been repurposed. Yeah. And the challenge, you kind of hinted at this, is so then you have to go back and look at childhood stories. And maybe the story you were telling yourself about that childhood is a different story than is the authentic story. If you find yourself today avoidant of intimacy, avoidant of sharing emotions, avoidant of saying, I'm feeling this right now, you have to start asking why once you understand this science. Right. And I would say, and I've written a lot, and I would say that you protect the stories. All of us want to protect 100%. The stories of our past. Yes. Like we want to make that as pretty and as good a story as possible. Yeah. So when you start telling an honest story about your relationships today, you can't do that without re-examining the stories you've told yourself about the relationships of your past. I mean,
well, more than that too, we don't want to be wrong about who we are, where we came from. I mean, there's a definition of trauma that is anything that challenges your universal belief, something that you thought was an unresolute truth. If that is shattered, that's a traumatic event or experience or a traumatizing state to go into. I think that we don't want to change a pattern because that makes us challenge who we are and our core beliefs sometimes, which is the ultimate fear, is having our core beliefs, our core foundations of who we are taken, challenged, changed, modified. But the good news is that can go to a better place. It's not a erasure. It's not a reframing of where you've come from, and as a result, how you act now. It's not a sentence. It's a strength, and that's, I think, what we have learned, and that takes grit, and that's resilience to get through that part of having to look back, look forward. And I think that this left brain, right brain conversation, and especially some of the activities that we're going to be doing on October 20th, some of the workshops, things like that we want to engage with, is an opportunity to kind of slowly step into observing your patterns in a way that is not this maybe a deep dive of looking back at your childhood, but more of just this reflection of what state are you in right now? What are you giving yourself permission to right now? Whether that is giving yourself permission, or what pattern have you gotten into in your relationships? Because I know certainly that I've compensated with either left side of me, left being my logic side, my facts, my reasoning, my data side, or the right brain, meaning my creativity, my imagination, my perception of shapes, colors, sound, and emotions. And so I think observing maybe from a bit of a more protected space, an introductory space of rather this whole view of childhood, adolescence, and your brain development as a whole, if you can start to understand in small ways every day, challenge who's on the side of the ship, activate both sides of yourself, you can start to, in little ways, understand, oh, I'm really in a routine of only being left-brained or right-brained. And as a result, that slowly starts the conversation of your relational patterns, of those patterns based on early childhood. But it's kind of like if you want to creak the door open and be like, all right, and close it again. It's not, you don't have to fling this door open to everything you've been through, which I think is a misconception about a lot of our work. It's like, oh, I don't want to go all the way there. And you hear this word trauma and you're like, who's got time for that? No one. But I think that it is not black and white, and it is not, fling that door open or keep it shut forever. It's these little micro habits and micro changes of challenging assumption, of creating new micro habits, activating parts of the brain together that we don't in day-to-day society. I think that is important.
Well, and you said something a minute ago too that I have, I've shared just, a little bit of my personal story, and you said it right. You came at this from a researchy, and we met at a time where you were finishing your education and were and still are very excited about the science. And then here I was going through this personal journey that, and all of it together helped make some sense of certainly my personal story. And here's something I tell folks all the time. You cannot get really good at understanding someone else until you understand yourself.
100%.
And I think that's some of the stuff I know we're talking about. I know folks are living in challenging relationships, whether it be spouses, friends, family. I know what we're talking about right now is resonating with a lot of people. And I know it can feel heavy. I know it can feel challenging. But the hope in it is that I don't think anybody's going to disagree that we're in really challenging times when it comes to relationships. And I would argue that it's because here in the West, we have become very, very left brain heavy.
100%.
I certainly think that's the case in politics, right? We've got two parties, and Rarely does anybody talk about what it feels like to be a part of those parties.
Yeah.
It's the platform.
Yeah.
It's the list of things that represent that party.
Mm-hmm.
And whether you're following that party or whether you are disdained by another party, it's based on these things that people ascribe to, this list of things that party stands for. We're awful at sitting down and saying, okay, you left brain logically follow this party. Here's the list of things that you represent you because of that affiliation with that party.
Right.
How did you get there?
Yeah.
Like, what are the things you experienced in life that got you there? The other, I'm very passionate about this work in the faith community. To me, there is no more left brain institution than the church. And when I talk about the church, I talk about the global church. It's this idea of faith is memorizing your scripture. Yeah. Faith is pray at certain intervals. And when you do pray, here's the words to
Order,
say.
date, time.
There, you go to church on Sundays. Yeah. There's a very scripted routine that we have memorized as part of, and then certain denominations have their own sort of recipe. If you're Catholic, your recipe is one thing. If you're a Baptist, there's another. That's all very left brain stuff. And you and I have had this conversation about, okay, I get that, but what are the opportunities in the church setting? And let me footnote, there are a lot of good things happening in a lot of good churches, but I think the greatest weakness is a right brain approach to the church. What does it feel like to believe in what I believe? What are the feelings you had getting to this place? Right. So, and I would finally, and then I'm going to let you cut me off, but I think our public school system is a very left brain system.
100%.
It's memorize this. You got a test coming up this week. Here are the left brain things you need to know to pass. Here are the acceptance standards to get into the college you want to go to. And what is struggling in the midst of that? Our kids can't have interpersonal relationships with one another. And I know this is a challenge you have had in your own life. So I'm going to...
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, that alone is such a... so that's a
and that'll be a podcast episode. But it is,
yes,
I think...
But truly, I mean, our students become our workers, become our seniors. Like, we are all the same people. We're one people, and we become different communities. So our kids become us, become our adults. And I think we're continuing to raise generations of people that are leaning into left brain because those are the school systems we're built into. There's a narrative right now that social emotional learning is not the business of a school, but look at it neurologically. That's an entire half hemisphere of the brain that a child is not getting to learn about. If that is really what the education system is for developing healthy brains and learning and processing, you're neglecting an entire side. And in ways that grade school and those skills, I think there's it's not correct that I think right brain equates to childhood, to youth, to kids. Think about the activities that second graders get to do versus a 12th grader. Right. Someone, 6-year-old, 7-year-olds, they're encouraged that they need time for art, drawing, listening to music, being outside, and some sort of imagination. Yeah. What I want to talk to the person that decided that was no longer something that needed to happen as the older we get. It is because of, I'm not going to say because of a corporate system that we live in, but because those things get put on the back burner as we get closer to having to step into, function, and thrive in an entirely left brain society. It's not that those things aren't important. I don't think anyone would argue that. It's just I have better things to do. Yeah. And that becomes a tagline that happens from middle school to high school, and then the classic tagline in adulthood. Once you're out of the education system, I have more things to do. I'm too busy.
Yeah.
I think I would argue with, I've got too much left brain right now for right brain. I've got too much left to do.
Right.
And I think that is, even if, like you were saying, on a level of politics, of religion, I would challenge anyone listening to take it a step further to your relationships, to day to day. When, think about the person you greet when you come home, the person you call on the phone on your way back from work. You say, how are you? How was your day? What do? You start listing what you did during the day. You say, I was here at 4:00. I had this meeting. I've had this, and this to do at this address, and now I'm on my way home. I'm going to go get groceries. I'll cook. I'll watch TV. I'll go to bed. You're listing. You're listing order, facts, information, statistics. You have to specifically say, are you okay? How did you feel today? What were you thinking? What were you feeling today? Because our automatic response is usually left brain. Yeah. Usually when someone says, how was your day? They say, it was terrible because this, and this happened. Not, I felt this emotion. I was feeling this level of processing. I was imagining these things happening while someone was saying these things to me. We just don't talk to each other like that.
Right.
And so I think that learning that balance, and I don't want to think that we're bagging on left brain right now, because I want to get into that too, of, I think that from your perspective and your approach of left-right brain in your own personal experience, you learned that you had a tendency to lean way too much into your logic side, your left brain, and it cut off those emotions for you.
100%.
I had to learn how to embrace my left side because my right brain was taking me away at a very young age. And I think that that's really important, and something that I want to make sure that we're making clear is that there is the point of health. A healthy brain is a activated brain and a connected brain. It is not one that leans into one or the other. Because for me, in my personal life growing up, I was so involved, and I had so little order, definition, list for heavy emotions that I was feeling, heavy creativity. I poured into the imaginative. I was always writing, always reading, always drawing, and always feeling really strong emotion. But from a therapeutic perspective, from a mental health and psychology perspective, the way to correct from being in that state to an unhealthy level is to bring some order, some definition, some listing into intense emotion and poor mental health. That's a key to therapy, is being able to identify what I'm feeling, recategorize what I'm feeling, understand the logic behind these emotions, label them. Labeling was huge, and then define, and then move on. And what that is that's bringing your left into your right when you're unbalanced in that way too. So I think that the whole idea is to identify where your scale is. Where am I leaning more today or not? And how can I challenge myself to get a little bit more regulated? Because when we hit that point of healthy brain activation, healthy regulation, that's when we're going to start living authentically within ourselves and living authentically with one another and connecting with one another.
Right. Yeah, because it goes together.
Yeah.
Like if we don't have a brain system that can talk well to itself in a healthy way, it's not going to be able to communicate with you in a healthy way.
Absolutely.
And too many of us end up in these spaces where we're trying to hide from this connection. So, and I love that you added in there too, that there is two sides to this.
Absolutely.
Like we can get trapped in the right brain side of things as much as the left brain. The key is to going back to being able to reflect on your own story, being able to pause. And I know going forward, we're going to talk. This can get sounding, because again, I know it resonates with so many people. And if it's resonating with you, it can start to sound heavy. It can start to sound hopeless. It can start to sound like, oh my God, like I'm defeated. And it's the opposite. Like that's the opposite. That's the hope of all of these conversations we'll have. All of the presentations that we're committed to doing is, again, once you understand how your brain developed,
Yeah.
how it is shaped and patterned today.
Right.
And once you understand that the brain keeps growing at a much, much slower rate than childhood,
Right.
but it keeps changing. These patterns, if you get intentional about them. And I'll give an example and what you can do once you understand this. And I wrote about it. Some of you may have read it, but it's been in the last 6 weeks or so. I didn't have to, but I needed to have a conversation with my son that I knew was going to be really, really hard. And it was going to be really, really hard because it wasn't going to be a left brain to left brain conversation. It wasn't going to be, let's talk about some facts of life. It was going to be, I'm going to have to share some emotion in my life. I'm going to have to share some memory and some experience in my life that I would rather not share. And when you've spent your whole life getting really, really good at finding ways not to share the hard stuff you don't want to share, that becomes a really hard conversation to have. When your expertise has been, and I promise you, there's little that I'm more expert at in my life than once a conversation starts to get uncomfortable, where emotion's going to come in, God forbid, vulnerability comes in. Nobody can find ways to dodge that better than me. Yeah. But this work we're doing, and certainly a lot of it has been in conversations with Marrin and other folks that I'm fortunate to work with and call colleagues and friends. When you have these conversations enough, you know, I can't have a healthy connection with my son or with anyone. I can't help. Here's the other piece of this we need to know. When we have these kind of conversations, this brain with my son or with Marrin, that other brain is being transformed as well.
Yes.
When we're inviting them in to feel different, to experience authenticity different, their brain patterns, whether they want them to or not, are being rewired as well. So I sat and had this conversation with my son, very intentional that I am going to share these things that every instinct in says run from. I'm going to share them instead. And I'll just say the outcome of that was life-changing. In many ways. It was certainly relationship changing, because he walked away from that knowing that we're not going to be afraid of emotions. Yeah. Like it's going to be okay to cry. Mm-hmm. It's going to be okay to hug. It's going to be okay to be angry. It's going to be okay to share the darkest secrets of any of our lives. And that as hard as that was, the outcome was closeness.
Yeah, there wasn't a healthier thing you could have done at the time, and it was the hardest.
Right. And you go in like feeling very disconnected, because that's just how I feel. Like that's when emotion comes, like I disconnect. Mm-hmm. And so you go into that feeling very distant. Mm-hmm. But the outcome of having that conversation was a closeness that I've rarely experienced. But it was because I took control of the brain that I now better understand than I've ever understood. Yeah. I knew, like, if I did not incorporate some right brain into this, like if we just had a left brain conversation, let's have the facts, let's talk about and then
and you would have never been able to tap into that had you not identified that you fell into that pattern of only being left-brained, only that list, only that order, that you felt like that was your role. You would have never been able to approach it and understand that you needed to completely tackle the other side if you hadn't seen that in yourself and your relationships and with him.
Right. And thinking about it now, like this is the first time I've ever thought about it this way, which happens a lot when you and I talk. But going back to the baby Elliot picture, like there was sort of a reversal of roles there, where he was feeling emotions 12 hours into his life. And he was fully expressing, this is how I feel. There are no barriers to my emotions whatsoever. And then I showed up. And there was a connection. Like it was a meaningful connection I ever had in that moment. we were kind of reliving that. And really it's the opposite. Like I was saying, here are my emotions.
Yeah.
And I'm going to show you that even as an adult, like, and I think that's critical. I think we think part of the aging process is we should get better control of our emotions.
Yeah.
When maybe the reality is we should be as unhindered in our emotions in adulthood as we are in a child.
Absolutely.
Because that's completely how I went into that. And in many ways, it was like his hand
Yep.
reaching,
Yep.
saying, no, I'm here. And so, and I think we all should want that sort of connection. And even if we don't want it, I know this, it's the healthiest
100%.
the healthiest thing for all of us.
Yeah. And I want to, that sounds like a good place to kind of to close this part of our conversation. But I want to finish off with challenging one thing that you said, because I really think it challenges what we're doing. I think it challenges weathering together. I think it challenges having these conversations of what you said about the more we dive into this, it's going to feel heavy. Yeah. And maybe there is a resistance, a heaviness, weight. I think that reminds me, and when you were talking about that, my first thought was, well, relational health is mental health, is physical health, is health. Yeah. And we would never think of whether it's a podcast on chiropractic or health outcomes, nutrition, no one would ever say like, talking about how bad it is to smoke is heavy. Think about what we let into school systems for DARE. When I was in middle school, they brought in a black lung on a like cart, and it was a human heart inside of a jar. Right. And that was okay. I mean, that was not, but it's heavy. However, it was for your health, and it wasn't a, scared straight. Some would argue that it was, but the point behind things like DARE, things like showing the realities of what happens when you smoke, use tobacco, substance abuse, any of that, and you're really familiar with this, is the point is to show this is what can happen when these things start happening to our physical health. Here's elements of how we can better our health, and here's what happens when you don't. Yeah. We're really comfortable doing that about physical health, very much so in this country. We're very comfortable talking about blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, substance abuse, tobacco. Yeah. What if we took the permission to talk about health effects with relationships? Suddenly it's like, too heavy. When you start talking about relational health, mental health, what if we took that model that we do embrace very much so, and we applied that to our relational health, to the ways that we are empathetic with one another, the things that keep us from true empathy, from true connection, and from living authentically. If we can approach heaviness with those eyes, that it's not heavy, it's just health, and it's just trying to get as close to our truth with each other and with one another as possible, I think we're all going to end up feeling a lot better, which is the ultimate goal. We all want to feel good. We all want to be well. No, and it's such a great point. And by no means do I want to project heaviness as much as owning that people, when they hear this, feel a heaviness. No, and I think that's 100% because of the stigma that you just did a great job of putting out there. So it is my hope and yours that as we have these conversations, like we would a DARE conversation, like we would a substance abuse conversation, like we would other health conversations, as we continue to have them, we can have them as matter-of-factly. Absolutely. It's not challenging. It's not challenging that the heaviness exists, because it sure does. It's challenging, have it anyway, have it in spite of, because learn to how to live with that and next to it and embracing it. And I think you and I have both talked enough to know about our own lives, not just relationships, just this wisdom we've both gained in life. And I always say, like, you're the youngest 50-year-old I know because of your wisdom. But I think we all know, like, the good stuff in life is on the other side of the hard stuff in life. I told somebody this morning, like, they said, your life in 3 sentences. And I said, I made mistakes. I learned from my mistakes.
And now I'm at a place where I wouldn't trade those mistakes away from anything. And that's because you learn from the hard stuff. You learn sitting there trying a whole new relationship approach with your kid that you've never tried in a relationship.
Absolutely.
And that came as much from learning and studying and telling myself a different story about life, not a different one, a more true story. And I hope that's where we will all come as we all sort of weather together. I know our excitement in this, our shared excitement, and has been for some time, I'm glad we're having these conversations now, is spreading the opportunity that we all have in doing life together well. Because one thing I've learned too is, man, it's exhausting. It's exhausting trying to do life inauthentic.
Yeah.
It's really hard to sit and have that hard conversation. But in the aftermath of that, man, life is far less exhausting. There's nothing to hide now, at least in that relation. There's no doubting who. And
that's a whole other episode too, is a greater conversation of, choosing your heart and whether, living that inauthenticity. I think it is the physical symptoms that come from that and come from living in those unhealthy patterns, relationships is just
and I think
huge.
It's like I'm laughing now because you are on my left and I'm on the right, and you very much are sort of the left brain of this operation in terms of, that's another podcast episode.
Identify,
and you write it down, you label it, and you are very good at knowing if I don't stop him now, he'll keep rattling on with all the emotions. So we will wrap this conversation up, but we will wrap it up by saying, one, go to weatheringtogether.com, weatheringtogether.com. There will be a lot of free stuff there that Marrin and I are going to share in terms of our writing. Both of us love to write, and snippets and parts and pieces of presentations. There will also be some paid opportunities to learn more. You certainly are not obligated. One of those will be an event we have coming up on October 20th, I believe. 7:00, we are going to do a presentation that really expands on a lot of this conversation. It's a presentation we've had a chance to do in some other communities. It's been well received. And in that, Marrin will also lead us through some exercises we can do, because it's not easy. Right, you just can't hear this podcast and then say, "Oh, okay, well, I'm going to go out and
left brain today."
Right. I'm going to integrate and do a better job of getting. No, there are some things we can do, and so Marrin and I will be talking about those in our 2-hour presentation on October 20th. So again, go to Weathering Together and see that.
I hope that event and the workshops and activities that I'll be leading us through, I hope it's something that, if this has gauged your curiosity and your personal interest, we hope that events we have in the future following our podcast, I want that to be an opportunity for you to feel a level of mastery in what we're talking about, and a level of power and excitement to share this with others as well. So those workshops and activities following the presentation, I want that to be something that you feel you can share with friends, family, students, co-workers, anyone within a community that you think that you would want to share this with. So we hope that that's also a resource and a reason for you all to come and not only join the weatheringtogether.com community, but to come to some of those events and start engaging with that content as well. It's something we really hope that can be a goal for us.
Yeah, because you can join the community for free. Just go to weatheringtogether.com, sign up for the community. You don't have to pay a thing. You'll then be on a list where we can mail. There'll be a lot of opportunity to have some free discussion around podcasts. So definitely be a part of the conversation, if for nothing else, to give us your questions, your challenges, things you would like to hear more about. So Marrin can say, "Oh, that's a podcast
so I can write the
episode
list.
down." And we have been talking about this for a long time. We're really excited going forward, and big stuff
Yeah.
to come. So
Thanks so much for listening, everybody.
Yeah.
We're so excited and we really appreciate it. And we'll see you soon.
Yeah, and I would say this did go like it was just you and me sitting around talking.
That's right.
And
That's
we
what we
recorded
wanted to
it
do.
today.
Yeah.
So. Hey, thanks all, and we will see you and hear. No, not see you, hear you. They'll hear us. You'll see us and hear us next time.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you. See ya.
In any weather, we're stronger together.